Hi guys, Totallydubbed here, and today I'm doing a video review on the Asus VG279QM. Now this is a 280Hz IPS Full HD gaming monitor. It also has NVIDIA G-Sync built in and has a quoted response time of 1 millisecond. And just to add a cherry on the top, it's also got HDR compatibility. So in this review, I'll be talking about all these features. It's pretty in-depth, so do check out the video timestamps below. In terms of the pricing of the monitor, it can be found for around £400 in the UK and around $430 in the US. If you live in these territories or indeed elsewhere, the locally link again in the description below will take you to your localized Amazon store. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first off, let's talk about the build quality. Now the monitor has a three-sided borderless design, so therefore the 27-inch monitor looks a little bit smaller on your desk. Its stand provides a full array of adjustments. Pivot, swivel, rotate, twist, you pretty much got it all. So if you don't like that stand for any given reason and you do want to have it, let's say on a multi-monitor setup, you'll be pleased to know there's VESA 100x100mm there for you to use. Elsewhere, in terms of the design of the monitor, it's got a plasticky blackish look with a kind of reddish trim. The red trim isn't too garish, which you might find on other monitors, so it's good to see that Asus hasn't gone overboard. Furthermore, there's no RGB lights, which I completely find pointless. Out of the 140 monitors I've reviewed, I do find that feature somewhat useless and redundant. So it's good to see it's actually not included over here, but if you're an RGB fan, you might be a little bit disappointed. Next up is the OSD. Now the OSD is accessed by a set of buttons at the bottom right of the monitor. There's a little joystick which makes it a little bit easier to navigate through the menus. Now in terms of what you find through the menus, it's pretty comprehensive. First off, you've got the gaming panel, which you've got overclocking, overdrive, adaptive sync, which is basically G-Sync compatibility, and also enables you to have FreeSync compatibility as well. I'll get into this in just a bit. You've got ELMB. Now this is ultra low motion blur, so this will work perfectly with G-Sync, which is pretty rare to find on most monitors, but it's worth bearing that in mind. If you want to reduce blur, you can do so, or you play in, let's say, really dark conditions. Just bear in mind that with that option enabled, it will limit the panel's brightness. Moving on from that, you've got Game Plus, Game Visual, and Shadow Boost. Then you've got the image section where you've got brightness, contrast, HDR, vivid pixel. Now vivid pixel makes the image look completely pixelated, so it's not something I would recommend. Then you can adjust things like the aspect ratio and adjust the blue light filter as well. Moving on from there, you've got the color. Now the color temperature is going to be important. In my case, you'll be able to see my settings. I just basically went on user mode and reduced the red out of RGB by a few notches. Of course, your mileage may vary. You might like to leave it on warm color temperature, but I found the user one to be a little bit better and a bit more suited to the sRGB color standard. Next up, you've got display inputs. Then you've also got ability to set a couple of favorites if you do wish to do so through the OSD. And then you've got the setup menu, which gives you the options of, let's say, disabling the power indicator, or actually knowing how the monitor's running in terms of what refresh rate and resolution. So next up is image quality. Now this is where things got pretty interesting. So much so that I ran my calibrator, which is the Datacolor Spider X Elite, several times through DisplayCal, and I found that the contrast ratio was laughable. When I say laughable, I mean 300:1 laughable. Now that's not normally present in any modern day TN panel, let alone an IPS panel. So after multiple different tries, I reached out to Simon from TFT Central. If you don't know what he does, do check out his in-depth monitor reviews down below. He actually reviewed this very monitor. Now, I found it very, very strange to see that it was 300:1 consistently. Then I was just like, why is this happening? I went through the OSD section, and usually I set it to sRGB mode, and therefore it calibrates it to sRGB and normally brings down the brightness. Now, Simon's interpretation of this was the fact that it was dropping down the brightness so much, clipping the overall contrast ratio, basically in terms of how it can handle the white and black from the actual panel itself, and therefore was creating a really low contrast ratio. Everything else seemed pretty normal apart from the contrast ratio. So then, after Simon's suggestions from going to the NVIDIA control panel and manually setting to full sRGB mode, it just still didn't work. Then I was just like, okay, before I actually send this back to Asus and say there's something wrong with the panel, I thought to myself, go to the OSD and set it to user mode rather than sRGB mode. Straight away from my eyes, everything seemed to pop a little bit more. So much so that when I put it through the calibrator, the contrast ratio shot up to 910:1, which was a complete contrast, literally pun intended, from what it was doing at sRGB mode. So I have no idea what was going on, but I can tell you that most people are not going to use it in sRGB mode. And to be honest with you, the monitor looks pretty well out the box, even in user or warm modes. As I mentioned before, if you do go on user mode and set the reds to 97 or 96, you pretty much got sRGB mode out of the box rather than having to go to a brightness limiting sRGB mode, which also can completely skew your contrast ratio. So this is pretty in depth for most people, and most people will not care about this, but it's something that I observed and I thought I should just share it with you. Moving on from there, we've actually got the overall brightness, and I'm going to allude to this back in the HDR section of it, but its maximum brightness was 368, which is perfectly fine. But it's not an HDR monitor, to be quite honest with you. And as I said, I'll allude to this in a little bit, but 360 nits is perfectly fine if you're going to be using it for gaming. In terms of its lowest nits, in terms of how low it can get, it got to around 90 nits, which most people might find a little bit too bright if you're in a completely dark room. You might want it to go a little bit lower than that. Unfortunately, this panel doesn't go lower than 90 nits, at least not from my test when I put to 0% brightness. Now, next up was color accuracy. Now, this was a pretty big one for me because I do like a pretty color accurate panel, and from IPS panels I'm normally accustomed to pretty good color accuracy. Unfortunately, it's not quite there, but it is very close. Specifically for a high refresh IPS gaming panel, this Asus panel did pretty good. With an average delta of 2.05 and a maximum of 9.85, that means this monitor will be somewhat suited for semi-professional photography work. But if you're a real professional, you will want a more color accurate IPS panel. Now, don't get me wrong, those people are probably going to spend a lot more money on a different type of monitor and won't be looking for hardcore 280 Hz refresh rate monitors. But still, it's worth considering if you're someone like myself who likes pretty good color accuracy but is also a very avid gamer. In this case, this Asus monitor is very good. So much so, it's the best looking 144 Hz plus monitor that I've come across. I know there's some 165 Hz monitors which are pretty good out there, but when you get to 240 Hz territory, you often get a massive tail off in terms of the color accuracy, namely because the panel technology is TN rather than IPS. In this case, this Asus panel did fantastic, and it's not just because of its IPS panel, it's because what Asus has done to it, which makes it also look great. What you'll also see over here is the sRGB, Adobe RGB, and DCI-P3 values. Now, just bear in mind that when I was testing this, it's tested against the sRGB value. You can see that it kind of overshoots the gamut volume by about 17%. In this case, it's not exactly perfectly hitting the sRGB the spectrum, but it's pretty close. And again, for a pretty high refresh rate gaming monitor, it's impressive to see these results. Next up was the brightness uniformity. Here, what I found is that the monitor was, at least in my case, a little bit off at the top right-hand side and slightly at the bottom left-hand side. Now, this is pretty much panel lottery, and again, this kind of feeds into backlight bleed, which again, you'll see an image over here of the backlight bleed of the monitor. It's not perfect, but again, for a gaming monitor, it's to be accepted. It is somewhat panel lottery, there's no doubt about it, and IPS panels are much worse than VA or TN based panels. But in this case, I was pleasantly surprised, and I won't say that I was complaining of any sort. I was happy with what the panel was that was in front of me. Next up is gaming. Now, this was very important for me, but first I wanted to check a few certain things before actually jumping into competitive games. First off was its HDR performance. Now, as I mentioned before, its HDR is somewhat laughable given the fact that you've got around 360 odd nits to play around with. In other words, this monitor might have HDR somewhat certifications of HDR 400, but really its HDR capabilities were pretty poor. when I tested it in Destiny 2, the colors were completely skewed. It looked completely off. And no matter what HDR mode I used, be it from the cinematic mode or the gaming mode, this monitor just did not look good. So much so that I saw myself resorting to a non-HDR image. Now, of course, your mileage may vary if you have a console or something like that, but in my case, I just wasn't impressed at 240Hz or 280Hz, which is HDR capabilities. It didn't look good. And in case if you're wondering, and if for some reason you do want to use this HDR, G-Sync did run simultaneously with HDR running over DisplayPort with my RTX 2080 Super. So it's worth pointing that out because sometimes that's not always compatible, but in this case it was. Now next up comes competitive gaming. So first off, what I wanted to check was for frame skipping. This is done via Blurbuster's tool, the UFO frame skipping test, and it was pretty easy and pretty quick to say that this monitor runs 280Hz. I had no issues with it, but there is even a little disclaimer that comes up saying if your overclock fails for any reason, you have to just turn off the monitor or yank out the cable and plug it in again for it to kind of pick up. Now for it to work, you do need to go through the OSD and enable 280Hz, as in its overclock, because this panel is a native 240Hz panel. So if you do want to run it at 270 or 280Hz, you have to go through the OSD. Now when it came to actually gaming past the setup sort of phase of it, I did find myself that 280Hz wasn't as good as 240Hz. Now, you'll have to hear me out over here, but the reasoning behind that is actually due to the response time of the monitor. Now, the response time of the monitor is directly linked with the overdrive. Now, the higher the overdrive, the lower the response time, and vice versa. In this case, on 280Hz, with the overdrive set to maximum, i.e. 100, the monitor was somewhat unusable. There was a lot of inverse goating, a lot of overshoot that was occurring, so much so that the monitor was somewhat unplayable. It's not something you would use. Of course, via measurements, you're going to hit, let's say, 1 millisecond quoted response time, but in a real world scenario, that wasn't quite the case. What was quite interesting, however, is that when I was running at 240Hz with the same 100% overdrive, the overshoot was less. Not to say it wasn't present, but it was much less, and therefore could be acceptable in a game that looks like a potato like Counter-Strike. Now if you're going to be playing somewhat like, let's say, Valorant or let's say Destiny 2, then that overdrive of 100 will still give you too much inverse ghosting for you to really enjoy the game. At which point you'll want to dial it down to 80, which for me personally was the best sort of setting. It gave the best sort of response time to the monitor and yet didn't suffer from so much inverse ghosting. So with the 280 and 240Hz response time tests somewhat done, I then moved on to input lag, and here I found the monitor to respond really well. At 240 or 280Hz, the monitor is really fluid in terms of responding with clicks. Now I use a Rocat 120 AEMO mouse, which is somewhat a perfect sensor mouse, and here I found myself to be really seeing that the monitor was responding extremely well to my input. So there's no complaints whatsoever with the input lag. Now this is really important because most times when I've reviewed 144Hz monitors or above, I found that the input lag and response time of these monitors hasn't been great. Sure, they might have had a really high refresh rate, but the input lag was something that often came down second or third. In this case, this Asus monitor did really well. So much so that I could see myself competitively gaming on it. Now, is it worth getting 280Hz over 240Hz? Truthfully, I couldn't see a difference at all. It somewhat, if you gave me an A/B test, I don't think I would have been able to tell the difference. Sure, there's 40Hz of difference there, but for you to push out 280Hz solidly at 1080p is going to be pretty hard, even if you've got a pretty beastly graphics card and a pretty potato game like Counter-Strike. The difference here is that in the past, when I was comparing 144Hz and 240Hz monitors, let alone this 280Hz monitors, is that these monitors suffered from pretty poor color accuracy or didn't have the best input lag. In this case, this Asus monitor seems to be somewhat the kind of ultimate competitive gamer. And this somewhat leads me on to my verdict. This monitor isn't super cheap. It is pretty expensive, and given the fact that you're only running at 1080p, you might want to still consider a 1440p 144Hz IPS panel instead, because it's going to give you double that resolution and it's going to make everything look crispier. However, if you're a hardcore competitive gamer but yet don't want to sacrifice on image quality like you've done in the past with 180Hz, 165 or 240Hz monitors that really looked pretty poor because they were running on TN panels, then this monitor is going to be your ultimate endgame monitor. And this is pretty big for me to say, but it is an absolutely fantastic monitor and one I would thoroughly recommend if you're a competitive gamer. Again, I can't stress it enough, it's an expensive monitor, it's not for everyone, but if you're a competitive gamer, you want great color accuracy, so therefore you don't want to compromise on anything, and you really want a good overall panel, then this Asus monitor is really, really good. So there we go guys, I've been Totally Dubbed. Hopefully you've enjoyed this review. It's been pretty in-depth, hopefully. If you've got any questions, let me know in the comments below. And of course, if you do like this content, make sure you give it a like, subscribe if you want to see more, and favorite and share. Alright guys, I've been Totally Dubbed. Take care and bye-bye.